to date. But here we go. So hopefully we can see, of course, that people familiar with the previous two webinars, that this, of course, is the form that we have been creating. As mentioned, there are a series of fields on here. And one of the features that we're going to look at today is as I mentioned, the idea of being able to hide and show certain fields based on configurations within the form. So we can see here, of course, that as an example, we have this type of issue option, where we can see there is this please describe. And what we're hoping to do is have this be completely invisible unless we select other here in terms of our configuration. Likewise, at the bottom where we have our file upload and this additional upload option, that is going to have the similar effect where this second file upload would appear and disappear based on the configuration that we are going to look at and create today using, as I mentioned here, what's called field condition sets. Now, before I continue, just like any previous sessions, I just want to clarify if there are any questions at any point throughout this, by all means, please feel free to put a message in the chat. I'll gladly answer it, and we can go through that. Not mentioning or wanting to look at there. But for now, as mentioned, let's look at configuring the form and implementing the field visibility using, as I said, these field condition sets. So what we're going to do is we're going to head back to the admin side here. And we are going to look for the form that we've been creating, the help desk form. Okay, now with this, as mentioned, the first thing that we really want to focus on for today is the field condition sets. So we briefly went over this in our last session when looking at the workflow side of things. If we can recall, of course, we have these different field condition sets created for each of the statuses that we plan to implement into the form. So we have our status new, in progress, closed, more info required, and more info provided. Now, if again, we can remember that in our last session when we discussed this, through our statuses, when we choose to create a new status at any point, so if I went to create another one now, it would automatically generate these field condition sets. Now these, as I said, these condition sets would then be utilized to allow you to configure stuff mostly for the workflow when it comes to status, to say that when it is in, say, the new status or in progress or anything like that, then it will allow certain functionality within the form to occur. So again, in our situation here, for instance, it would mean that you can only go to in progress or more info required if you're in the new status, and allowing you to structure your workflow appropriately. Now, another option here is, as we can see when we're in the field condition sets, is to create our own manual condition sets at this time. And what these will allow us to do is generate something a bit more specific based in the form directly. So instead of this being these ones here revolving around our statuses, we can generate new ones to reflect upon certain fields that we've built within the form ourselves. You'll also notice I briefly mentioned these in the last session, but even if you choose not to have any statuses on your form, you will always have these two condition sets created, which is going to be the default always and default being reported. And simply put, these are just sort of standard condition sets. This one simply meaning that by default, this is the standard logic that your form will be working for. And this is a very useful, especially for field visibility, this is a very useful condition set that will be utilized quite frequently. The other one here, default being reported, is similar, and it's saying that this is the standard, but only for the time that you're filling out the form, i.e. reporting it for the first time. After that, this functionality no longer has sort of a tie-in with this, and default always would be better for a broader sort of perspective there. But let's look at actually creating our own condition sets. As I said, these two are always going to be in every form that you create, but we can then build other condition sets to help work alongside those. So if we press the Add New Condition Set button here, we can, of course, see that the first thing that's going to ask us to do is give a name for this particular condition set. Now, these names can be anything. Let me open up a tab quickly. So realistically, there is what we would call a best practice for these condition sets, but honestly, you can call them whatever you want. And anything that's convenient to you or relevant, as long as you can look back on this and immediately identify what this condition set is referencing, by all means, call it anything. But normally what we would say in terms of a best practice is to keep through the similar logic as we saw with the status options here. So with our status equals new, in progress, etc., we can see that the wording here is the name of the field equals the response of that field. And as I said, it means that from a looking perspective, when we're applying this rule through field visibility or anything like that, it just makes it more stand out, clearer, defining exactly what this condition set is supposed to be doing. So in a circumstance like this, for instance, we might say, let's submit a ticket quickly just to look at it. We can see, of course, that we have this type of issue field. So when we're creating a new condition set, let's call it type. You can see I've done this before. Issue, and then equals other. Okay, and again, it just means that looking at this, we can clearly identify that this is reflecting upon the type of issue field, and the response of that field is other. It goes in the same sort of logic as the status ones, and it's just clearer and easier to define. Some of them might be a bit more complex, and you might have to word them as such, but realistically, I would try and keep things in this sort of realm. Now, underneath that, we can see, of course, there's these 3 checkboxes. And this is simply asking, based on the condition sets, where you want to use this specific condition set. So we can see, of course, that it can be used in field rights or field visibility. It can be used for the workflow, or it can be used for service level agreements, SLAs there. Now, at any point, if you're unsure if you want to use this for these, then you can select all 3 and nothing will happen. It won't break anything. It's completely fine to do so. So if you're unsure, if you're creating a condition set and you're thinking, do I want to use this in workflows? Is this going to be a part of workflows in any way? You're not sure, just select it. It won't hurt anything. It won't cause any issues when building anything. The only reason we would suggest maybe not selecting some of these, if you're very confident that you don't need it, it just means, as we'll see in a second, that when you're applying these condition sets, if you're adding them to sections that they're not relevant to, it just makes the thing a lot messier. There's a bigger sort of selection list or a bigger drop down to choose from because you're incorporating all of the condition sets. But again, some of them might not necessarily be relevant, and it just, as I said, it clutters the place really. But again, if you are ever unsure, it really doesn't matter. Click all 3. In this circumstance, I know for certain this one, all I want it to work with is hiding this please describe field. And that's tied to the field rights. So I do not need to use it for workflows or SLAs. So I am simply just going to remove that from those. Okay. Now underneath, we can actually see the form in a table format. And we can see each of the fields that we've created here, the type of field it is, and then the response of that field that we would like the condition set to work around. So we can see, of course, we have name, email, departments, exactly as we can see with this structure. And just as we go further down, we'll see that different options are available based on the type of field that we've created. These being text strings, they have a text value that we can add. But these select fields, of course, are giving us the definitive responses or the values that are created in those. So for instance, in this circumstance where we're saying it's the type of issue equals other, what we might want to do is select this, or in fact, what we definitely want to do is say that this is the field that we want this condition set to work around. And then the response of this field should be other, like so, okay? And simply put, that's all we need to select. And that's all we need to define for this. Because again, we're just letting the system know that when the other option from the type of issue field is selected, something can occur, okay? And that's all that this condition set really needs to specify here. As you'll see, of course, there are other options around here. And you might notice, of course, that these are checkboxes. So I could, in theory, select 2 options for my condition set here. And again, that's totally fine. And certain circumstances will even require this depending on the complexity of your form. But please bear in mind that if you're utilizing more than one field for a condition set, the rule or the logic here is and not or. So what I mean by that is in this circumstance, for instance, if I selected department marketing as well as type of issue other, the rule would have to appropriately state that the department equals marketing and the type of issue equals other. It won't be that this rule will work if one of those options is selected and the other one is not. Both have to be met in order for this more specific condition set to be created. So if you really need something very sort of granular, very thorough in defining exactly how a certain thing can occur, by all means, select more than one of these options or more than one of these fields. But as mentioned, of course, again, that means that both of the criteria or all of the criteria, if you're using more than even two, have to be met in order for the rule to work. Now, before we continue, we can see, of course, that the majority of these are fairly straightforward, but just going to the text string fields here, just clarifying a couple of things, because unlike the select fields, the user list, the radio, which all have their own predefined values, which we can simply select from, these are text fields. And of course, that means that they are open for anyone to write certain text or anything, depending on, of course, what the field is asking them to do. So because of that, we can see that there are these different options to define what this field should be achieving. So we can see here that I can select that, and then I have 3 or 4, should I say, specific value options to determine this. And the bottom 3 here really are sort of more numerical focused. So if you're trying to put like monetary amounts or something like that in, oops, sorry, you certainly can. That's absolutely fine. So what we'll say is, for instance, with this, you can say, if I select this one, and I can say, and that means that if this field value equals my name or another person's name, of course, I'd have to predetermine this and write that for all of them, then that will generate and allow me to specify and create a condition set revolving around my name specifically. But of course, because this is such an open-ended field, you would have to be very specific with the text that you write in here and everything that you create in that regards. In addition to that, the ones below, as I mentioned, are more numeric focused. So I could say that if this is a financial field, sorry, that's where I was going originally, we can say that this field, if it's sort of like maybe a financial request or a loan or something like that, let's say if it goes over 1,000, then, or it's equal to or over 1,000, then another section will open where it has to go to like a manager or something like that, for instance. You could quite easily create that functionality with this sort of field on here. This one here, of course, is greater or lower than a particular number that we've specified, and this one is a lower or equal to, of course. And then it simply just allows you to specify and put those as necessary. So that's how the text fields work, but as you can see with the rest of them, because the majority of these are predetermined values, it will just ask you to select the option here, and then you can go from that point onwards, of course. Now, once I'm happy with this, I can scroll down to the very bottom, and then I can simply hit save to create that. Now, another thing I just want to make aware, of course, is that if you are trying to make certain rules appear for every value or every option in a form. So let's say a rule was going to occur, of course, when I select other, but we wanted something else to appear or something else to change based on if I selected email, monitor, and hard drive as well, then I would have to technically create 4 field condition sets, 1 for each of the responses here. If I select all of them, again, that's too vague. It's going to say that basically if any of these options are selected, then a rule can happen, but it will be the same rule for all of those options. So if you did want unique functionality to occur based on each response, you will have to create a condition set for each one there as well. But yes, hopefully that's cleared up a couple of things there. But we can see, again, type of issue, other, perfect. I'm now going to hit save. There is another option here called trigger. Now, what this will allow me to do is convert this item into what's called a trigger. And triggers can be used for what are called automatic changes, which allows you to change the value or update or change a certain field in certain ways. Based on the response that you make using a trigger. Completely went blank there. But it also, triggers also work for notifications. So when you want to send an alert to someone, maybe based on a change of status or something like that, then that is also how triggers are utilized. So in order to make things a bit easier, if you want a trigger to work on a certain response using a field condition set, you can immediately just convert the condition set that you're creating into a trigger, and then that can then straight away be set up to allow you to send notifications and automatic changes, etc. Now, again, I know for certain that the field that I'm creating for this purpose will not need to be turned into a trigger. So I am going to leave that unselected, and I'm just going to hit save now. Okay, so there we go. There is my new field condition set. We can see, of course, that it says type of issue equals other. And then the field condition option is, of course, clarifying that for us. And then on the right-hand side, we can see all of the sections that a field condition set can be used for, and how many of those I've defined that this particular condition set can be used for. And again, of course, we can see that at this moment in time. Simon, sorry. Yes, just to clarify, it is case sensitive in terms of the text. Sorry, so Simon just asked a question there, which I missed until now, but when referencing the sort of text here, yes. So actually, apologies. So when it comes to names and stuff like that, it isn't case sensitive. It's character sensitive in terms of like spaces and things like that, but the actual capitals, etc., aren't. You can keep that as it is. Apologies, but yes, that will be fine. So if I had that, I could do it all lowercase, but of course it would have to be the appropriate spacing in between and things like that. Sorry, so going back to this, of course, as I mentioned, we can see that this is only being utilized for this. At any point, if I've said, oh, actually, no, I want to use this for workflows or SLAs going forward as well, I have the option here to go back into my condition sets and choose to include these options. Likewise, if I did want to use this as a trigger in the future, I also have the ability to just select this option here. You can also notice that I can make a copy of the rule. So when we mentioned, of course, that if I wanted to basically create a rule for each of these options, so for email, monitor, and hard drive as well, I could simply just change the name of this. I could change the response here, and I could say add copy of the rule instead of creating a brand new one entirely from scratch. Sometimes it can be a bit more of a speedier process, but especially if you're attaching triggers to them, I wouldn't recommend that because it actually slows down the process because it will already determine that a trigger is set up for the original one that you're trying to copy from. It won't allow you to create another trigger, so you'll have to go back in anyways and convert it to a trigger that way. So it's not always the best option, but there is, of course, that flexibility, as I said, to create a copy and make this just for monitor, for instance, or something instead. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to create another condition set very quickly. That was to load. Perfect. Add new condition set here. And this one, of course, is going to be defining or revolving around the second file upload option. So based on this being selected, we're going to make define whether or not the second file upload can appear. So once more, we're going to say something like, there we go, perfect, additional upload. Once more, this is only going to be used for field writes, so I don't need to select the other ones. I'm going to leave them blank. And then I'm going to say for this additional upload option, when the tick box has been selected, i.e. it's a yes, basically, then of course this rule can occur again. So done, there we go. So those are our two condition sets in this circumstance. For this form, that's all we might need. Now, based on that, of course, as I mentioned, these are just the sort of, these condition sets really are just the groundworks for these rules. They themselves don't necessarily do anything. So as we'll see here, if I quickly refresh the form from the front end, there we go. By selecting other or anything like that now, no functionality has changed. It's still the exact same at this time. The condition sets, as I said, are purely just the groundwork. We've now got this logic in place, and we can go to the appropriate behaviors in order to make certain things work. And in this case, what we want to revolve this around is the field visibility. This part of the behavior section is all around defining whether or not certain fields are editable or visible or anything along those lines based on the condition sets that we create. Okay. So when we first come in here, we'll see there isn't really a lot of sort of configuration or options available to us. There is a brief description, again, of what the field visibilities do here. But we'll also notice there is this manage groups button. And this is the first thing that we need to do and configure when it comes to the field visibility side of things, as this will allow us to list and store certain fields from the form into these groups, which will allow us to then utilize the condition sets to hide and show those fields based on sort of the requirements. So let's go and select manage groups. And again, when we first come in here, we'll see all of the fields from our form. They all exist on the left-hand side in this current group just called unassigned. And there's no logic or no rules that we can apply to unassigned. This is just a pool of all of the fields on our form and allowing us to add new groups to move those fields into appropriately. So let's create one here and call it, and again, these can be called whatever you need, as long as they're clear to yourself when you're building these. I'm just going to call this, that's not the right one. There we go. Type of issue equals other again. Now, again, these can be worded however you want, as long as it's clear, that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to add this, and then I'm going to add another one and say, right. So these are our groups. And then, of course, here are the fields, as I said, that we can move into these groups to allow rules and functionality to occur. Now, just because these have the same names as the condition sets, etc., it doesn't mean the condition sets automatically been applied or anything like that. We'll still have to add those. So if that is something that you might find a bit messy over time, then of course give them a different name. They don't have to mirror each other or anything like that. As I said, they can be called whatever is convenient or clear to yourself. But now, of course, as I said, we can move the appropriate fields to these. But it's worth mentioning that the field that we need to move is not the field that's going to cause the reaction, but the field that is the reaction, if that makes sense. So for instance, this type of issue equals other one, we don't want it to be the type of issue field, for instance, which again, may be why this is slightly confusing named-wise. What we want to actually put in there is the please describe field, the one that is going to appear or disappear depending on the logic that we're using. So I'm going to select that one, not the type of issue, and I am going to move it into that field, into that group there, sorry. Likewise, for this one, we'll see, of course, that our options here, I don't want to put the additional upload, even though that's the one that would be causing the logic. We want the one that is affected by that logic itself, which is this second file upload field, okay? You can tell it's the second one. Firstly, of course, by structure, it's lower down on this list, but also if there's a lot together or moved around, you'll also notice, of course, that the symbolic names are listed here, and this one has the numeric after it, meaning that this is the second one, this is the first created one, this is the second one that was generated by the system for us. And I'm going to move that to additional upload equals yes. Move that over. And of course, more than one field can list in more than one group. So if you have a whole section that needs to be hidden based on a response from a field, again, that's totally fine. You can include more than one to a group. It's purely just in this circumstance, it's quite a short and simple form. We don't necessarily need that additional functionality of hiding or showing more than one. So we're simply just moving one into them in these cases. But as mentioned, you can include multiple into a section like that. If you move them somewhere and realize that you don't necessarily need them there, you can always, of course, just select them again, and then just select a group option, just move them back to unassigned, hit move, and then, of course, it will just be left with the original ones or whatever you need to put there. I'm happy with those. Those are the only functions and fields I need into these groups. So I am now going to hit save, and that is done. Okay. So now I can choose to add more groups if I want to. I can change all of this, but realistically, all I want to do right now is go back to field visibility. And what we'll notice is our groups have been created, and with that, they have these new sort of tables applied to them. Oh, that's a very good question, Tim. So Tim here has asked if a particular field can be in more than one group. And the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. So as you can see, this please describe one, it can only be in the one option. If I did something like that, it would also be then listed under here, and then the rules to this group would apply. So that functionality isn't possible. But what you can do, of course, is apply more than one field condition set to a group, meaning that you can make it work on similar logic, even though it's part of a different group, if it needs to have certain visibility tied to it, but it also has additional visibility or logic on top of that. You can still reuse the same condition sets for groups. It's just fields can only be part of one group, if that makes sense. Okay. So here we go. Again, as mentioned, this is our little table. And you might have noticed here, of course, that based on what we've discussed in our second, I guess, session, realistically, was our project permissions. And here we talked about creating our project roles and, of course, the rights that we can give to those roles, allowing them to interact with the form in certain ways. But you'll also notice, of course, that with these, we created an admin, a support desk, and all users. And if we recall, there's always, of course, two hard-coded roles in here as well, the submitter of ticket and the ticket handler. Now, you might have noticed a second ago, but if we jump back to the field visibility, you'll see that those project roles exist in here as well. And it's basically going to allow us to be quite granular and say that we can have it just be a blanket, no one can see this, everyone can see this, etc., etc. But this will allow you to say that certain fields or certain sections, maybe if you want to build a group for that, is only visible to the support desk or the admin or something like that. If you need to make something a bit more hidden or, visible or invisible based on the roles that you're a part of, you have that functionality here as well. These roles or these rules are going to be quite simple though, and basically going to be all across the board. Why we'll see this all function come into play. But you might be a bit more creative. As I said, you can be quite granular with these if you choose to. But with these groups now sort of available, what we can do is, of course, look at adding these condition sets. And these condition sets will allow us to then have this define how this field should react. So, of course, we've created our new condition sets down here. You can see all the status ones have been included in here as well, although we might not necessarily want to use these because all the status ones had like all three of those checkboxes selected when they were created. They're going to appear in this list. And, you know, as I said, this might add to clutter over time. It's not too bad at this moment, but that's exactly what I was mentioning. When you're selecting checkboxes, you're unsure if a certain condition set should be applied to field visibility. By all means, select it if you're unsure, but over time, this will get a lot more busy and harder to find the ones you're potentially looking for. But as I mentioned, of course, we've created our two new condition sets here. The type of issue equals other, and the additional upload equals yes. So those are, of course, the defined ones that we've generated. But I also mentioned, of course, that there is usually this option here, or this will always exist in your condition sets, called the default always. And especially in circumstances like this, the default always is something that you will, funnily enough, always want to start on or utilize first when creating these sorts of rules or this field visibility. Because as you'll see, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select default always, and I'm going to say add. Okay. Now with that, this condition set exists, and we can say, or we can see, of course, that each of these roles have the option to either view the field itself, which is, of course, again, just to clarify this part, based on it being default always. So the default, the standard for this particular field, we want this, for instance, to be, and you can see by selecting each of these, it's going to allow us to say whether or not we're going to just leave this as a standard, which is technically allowed in this circumstance, or if we want this field to show up as default, or we want this field to be hidden, for instance, by default. And this all button just really helps us speed that process along. But by default, as I said, as the standard, we do not want this field, the please describe field that is, to be visible or to be editable, you know, straight away. So I'm going to showcase, of course, if I put those that rule in there, I'm now going to hit save. Okay, and what we'll see is if I go back to the front end of this, I'm going to hit reload. Done. And of course, now we can see that that please describe field has disappeared. It's completely vanished. And no matter what we do at this time, it won't come back, because we're saying the default, the standard to this is it just doesn't exist anymore, basically. Naturally, we haven't deleted it from the form itself, but based on these permissions, no one can see it. So what we then want to do is add another condition set to say that this is the standard. However, if the type of issue field equals other, then we are going to change the outcome of this and say that in this circumstance, when this condition has been met, then this field is visible and it is editable by all groups. Okay, so again, if we hit save there, like so, and hit refresh once more, perfect. So now, of course, we can see that that still doesn't exist. But if I hit other, the please describe button is now going to show up. It's going to, well, text field, should I say, I can now type whatever I need in there. But of course, if I select any of these other options again, monitor, for instance, or hard drive, that field will disappear once more because we are not meeting that specific condition. It's going to revert back to the default because we're not meeting that specific requirement there, okay? So that's why we want to sort of implement this functionality. It's also worth mentioning that when you're applying anything like this to your form, using the field visibility, that it works on sort of a priority system. Basically, the system will look from the bottom going upwards to your structure here. And then the first condition it sees it meets, it's going to take that and then run with it. So what I mean by that is if we were to change these the other way around, then the logic and the function that we've just managed to achieve will no longer work. Because if I hit refresh, reload, if I select other, of course, it's not showing up anymore. And the reason for that, as I said, is the system is going to look at this and go, okay, here's our condition. Well, here is our group. The first thing is default always. Yeah, that meets it. That's fine. And then it will continue from there. Because although this is technically also the case, and because it's the first thing that's being met or the first thing that the system sees, it won't proceed up the list. It won't continue to see if there are any alternatives. So whenever you're using default always or any functionality like that, always remember that it should be at the top of this structure, otherwise your rules won't work. Okay, so there we go. And then of course, with the additional upload in this circumstance, this is going to be very much the same. I'm going to say default always. We're going to use the all option just to speed up the process, but we're going to say that no one can view and no one can edit this field as a standard. However, once someone has selected the additional upload equals yes, condition set, or tick that checkbox basically, we will now allow them to be able to view and edit the field appropriately. And again, if I hit save, sometimes it can take a while. But we can see, of course, those changes have now been saved. If I once more go to the front end, reload, very much like this, this, of course, is currently showing. If I select other, the please describe field will appear. The second file upload doesn't appear as default, but of course, if we select this checkbox, it will now show up. But of course, I can hide that again appropriately. Cool. So basically, that is how the field visibility works utilizing these conditions. As I said, some of them can be a bit more specific or a bit more fine-tuned. We might say something like, as an example here, let's create a group called manager, for instance, move the manager field in there. And we can even just have like maybe one condition set in here, for instance, but we'll just have the default always. But we would say, for instance, that something like this, but the admin team can see it, for instance, or they could edit it. Something along those lines where you can, as I said, you can implement that granular functionality if you wanted to. Now, another thing to bear in mind here, of course, is I spoke about the priority of the structure here, where the system will always check the bottom line first. And if it meets a condition that's appropriate, it will just stay there and it won't go any further up the list. But this also works with the functionality from sort of a left to right. So permissions work in a sort of hierarchical standpoint, as I mentioned in our last session when we were discussing the project permissions. If you recall, I mentioned that we should, you should always have the highest project role that you create, or the role that you anticipate to have the highest control and permissions, i.e. admin or something like that, should always be at the top of the project permissions list. So like so, we can see admins up at the top, support all users, that sort of structure. The top should always be, as I said, the one with the highest permissions. And that goes very much into the field visibility functionality here as well, where based on that sort of priority, the one on the left here, for instance, all users, consider that to be the bottom. Oh, sorry, hold on a sec. Simon has a question here for me. So if the please describe field was mandatory and the user didn't select other, um, might they be caught in a loop as the field isn't visible but needs a value? So that's a very good question. So just to clarify what Simon is referencing here is, of course, that if this please describe field, as mentioned here, was a mandatory field, we made sure that it had to be filled out. But of course, if it wasn't being shown up because other hadn't been selected here, what would happen? Of course, when we hit submit, will it say field hasn't been filled out? And just to clarify there, Simon, it won't count that field because, of course, it doesn't exist. No one could view it or edit it at that current time based on the logic of the field visibility. So even though it's technically considered a mandatory field from the form structure, it's intelligent enough to know that that field doesn't exist in this current format because based again on the condition sets, it's not going to show up. People can't edit it. So you could just move past that. You know, if you've selected monitor, for instance, even if that field is required, you can hit submit and you won't run into any issues because, of course, I can't see or edit that field. You're welcome. So yes, so something like this. Now, as I was mentioning, of course, in terms of this priority structure, the one on the left-hand side is the one with the least control or responsibility. And the one on the right-hand side, of course, or the further the right you go, the higher your authority realistically is. So we mentioned the reason for that in the last session was if you're going to be part of more than one group. So for instance, technically we would be all users and admin based on our permissions. You know, this is going to be like all registered, and this is going to be a specific role or group of people. Which I would be included in both of them. So if these were the other way round, even if admin was allowed to view or edit this field, because all users would have been higher on this list, I wouldn't be able to interact with that because of course the permission structure is disabling that. And that also works with the submitter of ticket and ticket handler. So as we can see in this case, that as an admin, I can see this field, I can edit it, and I can interact with it. But as soon as I fill out the form and submit it myself, I can no longer do that because it's going to then, it's taking this admin control away from me and giving me the submitter of ticket control instead, which of course we can see is to not be able to see it or edit it. That's completely denied from me. If I was to fill out the form, as I said, I would change to this role and my permissions would no longer be the same, which of course can be a bit counterintuitive. You would expect, of course, that I'm an admin. I should be able to see that just because I've submitted this ticket as well. That's not what I want. So another functionality we saw here, of course, the default one was currently put as not set. And this can be very useful to apply to, say, ticket handler and submitter of ticket. Because what this will do is if these aren't set, it will default to your standard project role. So for instance, because this hasn't been given any definitive logic, it will go, well, he's an admin, so we'll just give him those roles permissions instead. So you don't have to worry about, oh, but I'm an admin, I want to see this, because this will then open up and allow everyone to see it as soon as they submit a ticket and things like that. So it can be quite hectic. So the not set functionality could be very useful for defaulting to your original permissions and sort of logic in that regard as well. But again, I just wanted to sort of hammer home just how configurable these can be and sort of granular they can be if necessary. So yeah, I'm not actually going to continue with this. Yeah, why not? Let's keep it like that. Let's hit save. So yeah, so there is another role that we've created, or another sort of group that's been created for our field visibility. Now, another thing I just wanted to quickly remind you or clarify, because we looked at this in our first session, and I know it's been a while since then. In order to make this field sort of show up and have this logic, of course, we need those field visibility rules in place. But in order to make that even sort of work and for the system to check that, always remember that when you're actually building the form, the field that's going to make that sort of logic occur, so again, the type of issue, the additional upload, those fields, when we edit them, again, make sure that the reload form and changing has been applied. Otherwise, even though we've put those condition sets and that logic in there, the form can't refresh to check that rule or anything like that. But yeah, just reiterating that part as well. Okay. Perfect. So are there any other questions revolving around that part for now? Does that all make sense to everyone? Okay, perfect. Okay, so Nanda has suggested, so you have a form where the submitter and the closer of the ticket can see it, but it has an approval process in between. Once they approve, they no longer see the ticket or status. Is there a way to do that, creating another role where they could see it? So I'm guessing here, just to clarify, so the current issue you're having is that they can't see it once the approval has occurred, but you want them to continue to do that. Is that the case? Okay, right. So there is certainly a way. So for instance, okay, so let's say the submitter and the closer of the ticket can see it. That's fine. It has an approval process in between. So there is a, okay, so there would be another role that you've currently created, for instance, called approver, for instance, and they can see it once it's been sort of assigned to them, I guess. But as soon as that part's been done, that visibility has been taken away from them. So it is certainly possible. You could create, if there's only a specific group of the ones who would take part in that approval process. So if it's only a small group, they can have their own project role here that you would add, and basically allow that role to have the view tickets permission as well. Because it sounds to me at the moment, based on the fact that certain people who are required to approve it, you might be using like the ticket handler, which will allow them to see it, but only when they are assigned the ticket. And as soon as, of course, they are no longer assigned due to how the workflow works, or once they've approved it, they're no longer a ticket handler, that permission is taken away from them. So potentially what I'd recommend is creating, as I said, this in-between role, or as you said, creating another project role that's just for the approvers, you could call it, approval team or something like that, and just allow them to view tickets. You might not even necessarily want to give them any more control than that, because the ticket handler will take care of like maybe the editing side of things and the other additions to that. It's just purely a case that allowing them to view any sort of submissions that have gone their way, etc., creating a role for them just to be able to view the tickets. And again, as long as it's only a small amount of people, because of course the thing that you want to probably avoid at all costs is having something like an all registered group being able to view tickets. So yeah, creating a small condensed group of people who would be responsible for approving, allowing them to view tickets for that project role and nothing else should resolve the issue there, I hope. Brilliant. My pleasure. Good. Okay. So fantastic. So the other thing, as I mentioned, what I want to cover today, with our field condition sets, of course, I've mentioned here that this works for the workflow. That's what we've looked in our previous session. And of course, in terms of field visibility, etc., this is all configured and utilizing these field condition sets as well. However, there is another option here called SLAs. And this is the third item in our behavior section that allows us to utilize field condition sets to some kind of functionality. And in this case, when it comes to SLAs, is response times to tickets. Okay, so for instance, we haven't actually implemented something on this form, but as an example, you could be quite specific with these. If I go leave here quickly, and if I look at the support ticket as an example here, we can see, of course, that you might have something like this, where you have an urgency section, which is a couple of different radio buttons or select options, depending on what you need. And maybe based on the response that you select here, you would anticipate the staff to respond to it quicker. There would be a different countdown timer for that. You can just have a general countdown, which is what we're going to see in this case. But the service level agreements are effectively allowing you to implement a response time. Okay. We can see, of course, with this little color on the left-hand side is indicating these response times. So if we look at like this one, you can see that it's currently within the SLA, basically, that's fine. It's a bit of a long time, but this is a demo site, so that's not a problem. But you can see, of course, that we can implement these, and based on different condition sets that you create, you can have a varying level of different responses as necessary. As I said, we don't necessarily have an urgency field on this form, so we're just going to use like a broad one, especially based on the time. But we can see how that works now. So all I'm going to really work on for this particular section is going to be the default always one, which can come in handy. As I said, if you're just going to have a blanket, and of course this is only for this particular form, I'd have to create different SLAs, of course, for every form that I create, if different ones are going to have different response times and everything like that. But for this case, well, of course, we're just going to use the default always one for a consistent countdown timer across every submission that's been made. Now, as I mentioned, all I need to do first is then go to the SLA section. And here, of course, we will see that there are 4 tabs. The first one that we're on is currently called traffic lights. And we can see, of course, that it's currently showing that there are no traffic lights in here. So the first thing I really want to do is create some. And these traffic lights, they are alluding to, of course, red, yellow, green in terms of sort of, you know, urgent levels of, you know, if it's still safe, if it's approaching a breach of our service level agreements. If it has breached that, for instance, that's what the green, yellow, red, yellow, green would sort of indicate. But they can really be any color. You can have more than that if that's what you need. It's just sort of a naming convention for SLAs here. But you can see if I go to this, add new traffic lights. There we go. It's going to give me a label, or ask me to put a label, and it's going to allow me to pick from a particular color for this. So I'm just going to say the first one here is going to be within SLA. And we're going to have a nice green for that. Done. Add a second traffic light. This is going to be called approaching SLA breach. Pick a color. Give a nice sort of orangey amber for that. And then another traffic light on here, which we're going to say is SLA breached. And let's have that as a red. Okay, so I am just using traffic light colors here to make it a bit more sort of visually clear, but literally, again, these colors can be anything that's useful to you or anything relevant maybe to your sort of colors for alerts in that reference. And of course, you can add more than just the 3. You can have as many as you need, but this is just a fairly sort of standard. When you first submit a ticket, of course, it'll be in this color. When you'll get, maybe let's say there's going to be a 10-hour response time to all submissions. Maybe when it gets to the 8-hour mark, it'll change to this one. So we can look at that and go, oh, we're getting close. We should probably look at this one first, you know, if you're reviewing the ticket list. And then, of course, when it gets to SLA breached, you go, oh dear, whoops, didn't need to do that. And then those are, of course, the ones that maybe someone would be notified or configured in certain ways. But this is, of course, where we want to try and avoid getting to. So that's the traffic lights that we've created. Now, there are 3 other tabs. The SLA rules is next, but I'm just going to actually look at these 2 first before looking at the SLA rules here and see how they work. So this one here is our work time. And simply put, this is asking us to define, based on the SLAs that we're going to create, when do we want the countdown timer to work from, okay? So we can see by default, this will set up from Monday to Friday every week, and the countdown will be from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And then as soon as it hits 6 p.m., that countdown will stop, and then it will continue again at 9 a.m. the next morning. This is a nice thing to put in place in order to, you know, prevent you from like maybe someone submitting like an urgent response 1 minute before closing. And of course, if it normally has like a 2-hour response time, you don't want to come back to, you know, the next day to something that you breached this when it wasn't necessarily based on, of course, your policies, etc., in your control. So this would mean that if someone submitted one at, you know, 5:58, it would count down for 2 minutes, it would pause, and then when it comes to Tuesday morning, the countdown would continue counting up to that 2-hour point from there onwards. Now you can change these to be more appropriate. You can include the Saturday and Sunday. If you wanted this to be a full 24-hour countdown, you can simply just go midnight to midnight, like so, and that's fine, and it will count down that sort of functionality there. But it really depends on, again, your sort of requirements, your structure, and your sort of procedures. But you can specify the times here as well to your preference, really. Now, on top of that, based on the sort of standard ones here, something you might be familiar with is our holiday planner application. If you're utilizing that in any way, you will be able to create what are called zones in there, holiday planner that is. And those zones, you can specify certain global holidays or public holidays for maybe, you know, like certain bank holidays, things along those lines. And if those are scheduled or applied within the holiday planner, you can select the zone that they would be utilized for. So for instance, you can see there's a UK one on here. So this could, for instance, take into account all of our bank holidays, our national holidays or anything like that. And this will mean that if there was a day off, like a public holiday on a Monday, then that Monday specifically, based on what it says on the holiday planner, wouldn't count down either, because it's technically considered a weekend or something like that. So if you had any of that functionality, even if you weren't necessarily using a holiday planner as fully, you can still use the zone section. So you can see in this common holidays part, we're using the UK zone here. And as I mentioned, I can select a particular day, put it as a global holiday, and it would take that into account for the SLA countdown timer there as well. So that's something to maybe consider if you were utilizing those features. The other option here is the status section. And what this is simply going to allow us to say is if we're using the stopwatch time, some rules, how do we want it to work on each of the statuses in our form? So we can see, of course, that this is based on the statuses I've already created. I created in our last session. Again, we have our new, more info required, more info provided, in progress, and closed. Now, each of these we can see on the right-hand side is saying the stopwatch timer action by default is to start the timer from the beginning again, basically. So going back to 0 and counting back up to the time frame. So let's say that we would have through the entire lifespan of a ticket, ideally it's going to be, as I said, like, I don't know, like a 10-hour response. That's ideally when everything should be resolved and sorted. So what this would currently do is, if we were planning to do that, is when it goes into new, the countdown timer would start. But then as soon as it moves status, the countdown timer would reset and count down from 0 again. And that's obviously not going to be very accurate for what we need. So potentially what we can do is change these functions here. So we can say, when it's new, of course, we want to start the timer. Let's say when it goes to more info required, because that's actually going back to the end user. That's not currently with us. We still need more information. So it's unfair for us to maybe be penalized or the SLA to be breached when it's again back with them. So what we could do is we could suspend the timer at this point, okay? So when it's back with the user, because we need more information, we can say, okay, the timer's paused at this point. We can then say, as soon as it gets, they've filled out the appropriate information, they've then moved it to the more info provided status, we can continue the timer. So we're not starting it again entirely from scratch. We're saying that this is going to carry on from where it left off last time. And then, of course, following on top of that, we can say when it's in progress, the timer will continue to count down further. And then, of course, when it finally gets to closed, everything's been done, we will stop the timer, okay? So that means that's the final part of it. Whatever that's showing at that time shows exactly how long it took to resolve that issue, okay? So I'm now going to hit save there. That's fine. And of course, that might be an appropriate sort of structure. Of course, the more statuses you have, the more sort of flexibility and structure you can put in this if necessary. But for now, that's, perfectly fine. So with that, then, we're now going to go to the SLA rules. And again, this is currently blank, but it's going to allow us to create new rules, and utilizing our field condition sets, we can then build a variety of different response times and structures based on these SLAs. So let's say add new rule. And of course, because of this form, we don't have like a priority thing, which would be quite useful, like an urgency thing, to say that each one, if it's a high urgency, it will be a quicker response time. This is just going to be a general one for every ticket submitted in this particular form. So all we really need to focus on is the default always status here. And we're going to say by default, we're going to use either the stopwatch timer or from the latest status change. These are the two sort of countdowns you can utilize. The status change here basically means that if you're building this entirely from different statuses and things like that. You want them to start from scratch pretty much every time. You can use this, but the stopwatch timer allows you to, of course, be more flexible, as we saw, and have continued time frames pausing it and things like that. So we're going to keep with the stopwatch timer for now. The default always one, and we're just simply saying then that this is going to be the standard condition set for every submission that's made. But we'll say that we want to use all of these traffic lights, and we're going to say that the within SLA1 will show up at 0 hours and 0 minutes. So from the very beginning, it's going to be green and it's going to say within SLA, okay? But let's say, of course, as I mentioned, arbitrarily, we'll say that this has a 10-hour response time. So we will say that, of course, after 8 hours, okay, and 0 minutes, it will change to this amber alert to inform us that this has been left unresolved still for 8 hours now, or maybe even more. And this is something that we really need to focus on in order to prevent an SLA breach, basically. And then, of course, what we can say is that at the 10-hour mark, this is going to then change to this red alert and inform us that we haven't met the response time for this particular ticket. It hasn't been resolved when we were, based on our policies, what we plan to do. We haven't met it for this particular ticket effectively. And that's how you can build your SLA. So again, this is just the default one. I don't have any necessary specific condition sets revolving around that. But again, if we look at the admin side once more, and we go to Infocapture again, looking at the support tickets one, as I mentioned, because this, of course, does have different priorities, just so we can see how it might look. If we look at the SLAs here and look at the SLA rules, you can see that this can be based on all of the different statuses and stuff. But as we've got here, when there's a critical problem that's been submitted, you can see the response time is a 1 hour. When it's a high problem, then it's 2, medium 3, low 4, for instance. And then, of course, after a certain period of time, it will also then go to the resolution time. Like, this could, to be honest, all be included into the same ones. We've created it a lot more broad, I suppose, on here. But realistically, this could just be sort of tied, because they're using different condition sets, but you could realistically just use the same condition set and say after 5 hours, it would go to the resolution time for each one, for instance. But this is just to give you, as I said, a bit of an insight of how much more sort of flexible these SLAs can be if you needed to create them in that way. But of course, as I said, it can be just a lot more sort of standard, and it's just one size fits all in this case. And it just means that you have a 10-hour response time for these tickets. And from there, once it gets to that, as I said, you've failed the submission effectively. So if we now go to Infocapture once more, just to show this. Help desk, that ticket, it's the only required field, isn't it? Okay, we can see, of course, that it is within the SLA, and as mentioned here, it's going to change. Well, it should be 7 hours, 59 minutes, maybe I put that incorrectly. But as you can see, basically, that's going to show that this is going to change at a certain point, etc. But yes, those are the SLAs and the field visibility, and the features mainly tied to the field condition sets there. So again, that seems to be everything for today. Again, thank you so much for your time, everyone. I hope this has cleared up a couple of things of how the system can work. But yes, again, thank you so much for your time. As mentioned, this has been recorded, will be added to Discover if you need to look back at this at some point. But take care, everyone, and have a lovely rest of the day.